Honestly, I have no idea why I didn't do this comparison earlier in the year, but here we are. Today we're going to be comparing the iPad Air 3 to the iPad Pro. Both are more similar in price, but there are several key nuances that I want to go over today to help you decide which device is right for you, whether you should save your money and go with the Air or spend a little more and go with the Pro. But before we continue here, I'd really appreciate it if you leave a like on this video, comment if you have any questions, suggestions, or opinions, as the algorithm likes that and will help push my content to more people. So the first and most obvious difference is in the design language of these devices. We have a new industrial look with the 2018 iPad. It's a lot more angular and futuristic. There is no home button as well. You have purely navigational gestures with this device. Whereas with the iPad Air 3, it takes after the iPad Air 2 and the iPad Mini that was launched in 2012. So this is a pretty legacy design. It's more rounded, and of course, you have a home button with it as well. And to quickly compare the biometrics here, I think both are equally fast and pretty convenient as well, although I do like just looking at my iPad to unlock it. That is a plus with the iPad Pro. Another key design distinction is what you do with the Apple Pencil. With the iPad Air 3 and pretty much every other iPad, you have the first gen pencil, which kind of chills around it, and of course you have to plug it directly into your iPad if you want to charge it, which just looks dumb. Whereas with the iPad Pro, you get the second gen pencil, which is a bit more expensive, albeit it attaches right to the side of the iPad and charges very, very conveniently. These devices also differ in input. With the iPad Air 3, you get the legacy Lightning port, which has been around since 2012, whereas with the iPad Pro, you get the very versatile and new aged USB Type-C, which allows you to connect to external storage very easily and to other adapters you can buy off Amazon to connect to like SD card readers and such. So yeah, the port or the input with the iPad Pro is definitely superior and will accommodate more professional work. There's also a difference in the speaker setups on here. You just get two down-firing with the iPad Air 3, which is technically kind of like stereo, but not really, because it's only coming out of one side of the device. Whereas with the iPad Pro, you get a real stereo experience with 4 separate drivers on each of the 4 corners. I'll do a little test here to give you a listen. So after that test, I have to say, I'm impressed with what the iPad Air 3 can muster. However, it just doesn't sound as full because, of course, you're missing 2 speakers that you could find on the iPad Pro. So if you're looking for superior audio for, I don't know, music production or just media consumption, then this is definitely the device to consider. But if you're not super freaky about that, then this will suit you very well. And speaking of audio, there is a headphone jack with the iPad Air 3, whereas with the iPad Pro, you're out of luck. So if you want to use wired headphones, then maybe the iPad Air 3 is going to be your go-to device. But I don't think it's a big deal because there are definitely a lot of great wireless alternatives today. And then once again, due to the home button, you do get home button based navigation as well as some gesture based stuff with the iPad Air 3, whereas with the iPad Pro, it is purely gesture based, which I actually prefer, especially with the 120 Hz display on here, which we'll talk about. And also something to keep in mind, I would really not worry about this in most circumstances, but the iPad Pro is a little bit more prone to bend if you're really, really careless. So if you find yourself being someone who's just kind of throwing your iPad around, then this might be the more durable option. Oh, and before I forget to mention, both these devices do have smart connectors. On the iPad Air 3, it's located on the side, and on the iPad Pro, it's located on the back, but both serve the same function. Both allow you to connect to keyboard cases and power them without Bluetooth. Next up, let's talk displays here. We have a 10.5-inch display with the iPad Air 3 and an 11-inch display with the iPad Pro, so size is not that much different. The bezels, however, are you have thinner side bezels with the iPad Air 3 and thicker top and bottom chin bezels, whereas with the iPad Pro, obviously, you have pretty much uniformly sized bezels, which I think looks more futuristic. I think a lot of people think that as well. There is no home button once again, and another big distinction is in refresh rate. While the image quality is very similar between these two devices in regard to PPI or resolution, brightness, contrast, and color, the refresh rate is totally different. You get 60 Hz max on the iPad Air 3, whereas with the iPad Pro, you get 120 Hz max, which is double that of the iPad Air 3. This is called ProMotion, and it makes interacting with iPadOS just a dream. I mean, it looks so much better and so much smoother. So interaction and writing just looks buttery in comparison to your typical 60 Hz experience with the iPad Air 3, which is by no means bad. But once you use this, you might not be able to go back. While I don't think that this feature is absolutely necessary, it definitely makes the iPad experience much, much more enjoyable. So if you do like it enough, I would spend the extra money. And if the rest of the components and the pricing of this device doesn't make sense to you, then obviously the iPad Air 3 with its refresh rate and display should suit you just fine for work and play. Next up, let's quickly talk battery life with both these devices, and in my experience with pretty much every iPad, I get similar screen on time. Apple's screen on time figures on their website seem to be pretty accurate, and you get around 9 to 10 hours of video playback and just general everyday usage with both these devices here. Charging to me doesn't really take longer on either of these two devices. There's no wireless charging yet, so really you're going to get similar battery life with both these devices. Maybe a little bit less with the iPad Pro because the processor inside is a bit more beefy, but still, I have not noticed that much of a difference, and if you're doing basic tasks, you should pretty much get similar battery life with both these devices. And of course, if you're doing heavy, taxing tasks like gaming and video editing, then both these devices are going to drain more quickly as well. Next up, let's talk camera quality here, and first up, let's talk about the front-facing cameras on these devices, because both feature 7 megapixel front-facing sensors that take similar pictures and give you similar front-facing image quality. However, with the iPad Pro, you do get the Face ID tech inside, which allows you to do portrait selfies with the depth sense and all that stuff, and also Face ID, as I mentioned. It also enables you to do Animoji, which is a fun feature, but by no means a deciding factor between these two devices. As for the back-facing cameras, you get a 12 megapixel sensor with a flash with the iPad Pro, which is capable of recording up to 4K 30 video, whereas with the iPad Air 3, you get a single 8 megapixel sensor on the back with no flash that's capable of shooting up to 1080p 30 video. So if you're doing any serious video or photo shooting with your device, obviously the iPad Pro is going to be beneficial to you. However, I always say don't be a iPad photographer or videographer. If you have to be, obviously go with a device with the better camera, but both should be fine for taking pictures of mundane stuff like documents and such. However, I will say the flash on the iPad Pro is definitely useful if you're taking pictures in a darker environment. And last but certainly not least, let's talk about software experience and performance here. And in terms of everyday tasks, you know, like web surfing and video playback and just general UI navigation, both of these devices are going to perform pretty much identically. The A12 and the A12X here, as you can see, have very similar, if not identical, single-core scores, 1116 with the iPad Air 3 and 1112 with the iPad Pro. And single-core scores do kind of dictate or kind of reflect what everyday performance should be like, so it's pretty much equivalent. Whereas with heavier tasks, the iPad Air 3 pales in comparison to the iPad Pro because multi-core scores kind of dictate how well you're going to be able to game at higher settings and video edit and all that. So you get 2667 in terms of multi-core scores with the iPad Air 3 in comparison to 4563 with the iPad Pro. So if you're going to be doing a lot of 4K editing or heavy gaming, then obviously the iPad Pro is going to be the device that you're going to want to pick up. It rivals the MacBook Air and some lower end MacBook Pros. That's how powerful it is. So if you're doing any major work and you depend on it being quick, then the iPad Pro is definitely your device. But once again, if you're going to be doing some everyday tasks like web surfing and YouTube watching and all that, then either device is going to be great. Obviously, if you can afford it, the iPad Pro offers a really nice 120 Hz buttery smooth experience, but the same can be said about the iPad Air 3. Although it doesn't have ProMotion, it offers a really nice work and play experience too. Gaming on both should be similar too, especially if you're not playing anything too intensive. Split screen multitasking is a very nice experience on both, and I gotta say, if you're choosing either of these devices for schoolwork like college work and note-taking and whatever, you really can't go wrong with either. Of course, you just have to know you do get a better display and a more futuristic experience with the iPad Pro. I also will reiterate, having USB Type-C is just so much better than Lightning. I believe it's faster in terms of data transfer. You can connect it more easily to a display and to an external drive and just to really any input like an SD card reader or whatever, in comparison to the more limited input that comes with Lightning. So it all comes down to this final recommendation I'm going to give you. If you want a premium iPad experience, but you don't necessarily need the 120 Hz display, the snap-on pencil, the extra multi-core performance here, and you're perfectly happy with the form factor of the 10.5 inch, then by all means buy it, save your money. You could probably buy an Apple Pencil with it for the same price as the iPad Pro 11. But if you need a bigger display with the iPad 12.9 inch, or if you just want the more futuristic industrial look with the iPad Pro, as well as its ProMotion, its snap-on pencil, and the increased multi-core performance, which will accommodate 4K editing and really intensive workloads more, then by all means get the iPad Pro. It will be worth your money, and you can find it cheaper now than retail, especially now that it's over a year old. I got mine for $669 at Micro Center, and I could not be happier. And that about wraps things up here. Once again, I'd really appreciate it if you leave a like on this video, comment if you have any questions, suggestions, or opinions, and subscribe for more content like this. I got some Motorola Razr content coming up, which I'm super excited about, so stay tuned for that. And other than that, I'm Noah, and I will catch you all in the next one. Good morning, Vietnam. It's me, Noah, and it's 4:13 a.m. and I wanted this video to be 10 minutes, but of course it can't be. It has to be like 35 seconds off, so I thought I would share my Spotify Wrapped 2019 playlist to fill up the remaining time. I think that my list is pretty interesting. Apparently I'm genre fluid, so go ahead and give me a follow if you want to see what I'm about musically, and let me know what you think about my taste in music. I don't know. I need to go to bed.